Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced on Thursday that the EU would provide a new €4.7 billion investment package for South Africa. This comes as the head of the Commission, as well as Council President Antonio Costa, are attending the EU-South Africa Summit in Cape Town, marking the first summit since 2018. Now, this event provides an opportunity to reinforce the EU's partnership with South Africa amidst escalating global tensions. In addition, we'll also touch on the shifting political dynamics as the United States looks to pivot away from Africa's largest economy. Now to discuss these topics, I'm joined by Tara O'Connor, founder and executive director, Africa Risk Consulting. Good to have you on the program. So before we begin, let's just go and share with you and our viewers a short clip here from Ursula von der Leyen that was just recorded a little while ago. Let's hear what she had to say.
Today, we are together announcing an investment package to mobilize €4.7 billion in South Africa. And this is in both our interest. It includes funding for the clean energy transition, but also funding to boost vaccine manufacturing. South Africa wants to protect the health of its people, as well as your autonomy and your local industries. We Europeans want to diversify some of our most critical supply chains, and we know that viruses know no borders. So that is what I call a true mutual interest.
All right, so there we have €4.7 billion, a massive thing. We've just heard a bit on vaccines, about energy transition. What do you make of this major announcement? What other kind of takeaways can we get from what Ursula von der Leyen just said today?
Well, I think the very first thing to say is that this is a warming of relations, a renewal of relations with South Africa after a long period of froideur, shall we say, after the South African government, in its former dominated ANC self, has been very sort of probably quite weak on its position against Russia. So, and that caused a coolness between the European Union and South Africa. And now that the US relations and trade with South Africa is very much in jeopardy, there is very much a rapid warming, rewarming and rekindling of EU-South Africa relations, which is, I think, the biggest takeaway.
Mm-hmm. As you said, there warming of relations, also mentioned really briefly as well, Ursula von der Leyen saying this energy cooperation is just a reminder of viewers, this just energy transition, where the United States has pulled out of that in recent days. So how does this work now in terms of the next steps? Does this bring South Africa closer back? Is now something like BRICS, is that not as relevant anymore? Is this the beginning of something else? How do you perceive it?
I think this is definitely a pulling together of the South African government and the European Union in the face of the threat of an absent US and all that means. Absent from the climate change treaty, absent and definitely placing South African-US trade under threat. South Africa is one of the biggest recipients of trade benefits from the AGOA trade agreement with the US, and that is that's due to be renewed this year, and most people think that Donald Trump will not renew it. So not only does this provide a huge opportunity for the European Union and South Africa to both step up the important energy transition, a fair energy transition, reminding everyone that South Africa is one of the biggest coal producers on the continent. And so it definitely, and miners, there's a huge mining community that relies on coal mining. So the funding that will be provided by the European Union for the just transition would be very welcome.
Mm-hmm. And also, Russia is obviously a major theme here as well. South Africa is part of BRICS. This is something that they've shared closer ties with. You mentioned it's since 2018, there's been a pause of these meetings. I mean, a lot is going on at the moment in the world. It's hard to judge, but how do you see this now? Is Russia now a weaker partner in terms of Africa and particularly South Africa now because of what's happened recently?
Well, I think there's one very big difference that has to be taken into account with South Africa, and that is that since its last elections, South Africa is in a coalition government where the ANC no longer has a totally dominant control on all policies. It has to take into account its junior coalition parties having not won an outright election. And the junior parties in the coalition government have been very critical of the dominant party, the African National Congress, for not following its trade relations. I mean, the EU is an enormous trade partner of South Africa, and yet relations tended to favour Russia for historic reasons over the major trade partner that the EU is. So while I think South Africa will reserve the right to always to determine its own trade relationships and its own relationships with Russia through the BRICS arrangements. And yet this is definitely a new pragmatic approach on both sides.
Mm-hmm. As you said as well, I think we just remind our viewers the biggest foreign direct investor in South Africa, that's the EU as a whole, I think accounting for about 53% of investment. So as you said, very key. I want to ask you about another big connection here, which is the G20. South Africa is presiding that this year. There's that summit going to be in South Africa later on in the year. So what the impact will this have on that? South Africa is clearly going to be setting the agenda there.
Yes, again, energy transition, greater trade and investment, and the three things that were brought up by Ursula von der Leyen are very much part of the South Africa agenda as well. But as you said, things are moving very, very fast in the region. We've recently seen South Africa take South Africa's role on the continent as the dominant military power take a knock in Eastern Congo. So things are shifting very fast. We also see that that South Africa, Marco Rubio is not going to be attending. The US is probably not going to be attending the G20 summit. So those sorts of issues, the shifting into geopolitical scene, plus the local regional position of South Africa is all important. For the European Union, also, we see it's a very pragmatic approach from the European. It will be another important stepping stone in the improvement of relations for the European Union, as well as European Union seeking to diversify its supply chain. We've seen Ursula von der Leyen sign a very important similar agreement with the Mercosur agreement with the Latin American countries. So a lot of what's on the agenda is very much climate change, but also diversification and protection against a very arbitrary international affairs that is the mark of a Donald Trump's return.
Right. And I think also one question briefly towards the end now as well, with, let's say, Russia's changing role as well. I know it's different, the Sahel, this is sub-Saharan Africa with South Africa, but how, just briefly, Russian narratives been perceived, particularly in South Africa? We know that they've done a lot of disinformation, misinformation campaigns.
Yeah.
Have those changed now recently? Is that now more on the out, or what's the state of those? Just briefly at the end.
No, very much so. Russia is still very much pumping out sort of an anti-colonial narrative right across the continent. Very interestingly, Russia today is setting up an academy in South Africa to presumably train South Africans in its particular in the art of misinformation and to continue that sort of propaganda bombardment of the continent. So you still very much have a very long historic relationship between lots of South Africans who were, formerly disadvantaged South Africans. Black South Africans have a very warm and fond relationship for Russia because of its stance against apartheid during the Cold War. But it is it's not really a real, what's interesting is the irony that Russia's war against Ukraine is effectively a colonial war, and Russia's Soviet stance was very much anti-colonialism, and the propaganda that is put out is against the neo-colonial approach of the West, which one hopes that will partly be undermined now by a very high-profile visit by Ursula von der Leyen and the attempt to stabilize the relationships between Africa's prominent democracies like South Africa and the European, what seems to be now the bastion of democracy that is now Europe.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, just one last one, if you'll allow me. You mentioned Mercosur as well, that trade deal has been ongoing 20 years between the EU and South American nations. What's the likelihood of something now also of similar ilk forming now with South Africa and other nations? Is that now more on the cards, you think, after this visit?
I definitely think so. I think we should, Europe will be looking to restore its relations to perhaps become a competitor in certain areas with the dominance of China across the continent, but also to see South Africa for what it is, a highly industrialized country, which is the gateway to not just the SADC region, which is one, we must remember that South Africa before COVID was the fastest growing, Sub-Saharan Africa was the fastest growing region in the world after Asia. So, it is also a pragmatic approach to develop relations with the gateway to the rest of the continent in the fastest growing future region, and a region that also holds all the transition metals and minerals that are needed for the energy transition. Mm-hmm. So a very practical outcome for both South Africa and for the European Union.
Right, indeed. So interesting to watch, and we'll see those developments as they continue, and it's going to matter for the whole world. Thank you so much, Tara O'Connor there. Appreciate all your insights today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching. That concludes this edition of World Talks, but stay tuned for more news and commentary right here on TVP World. Goodbye.